All right. Good evening and welcome. My name is Jessica Chen, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. As always, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our museum members and those tuning into our live web broadcast at 911memorial.org/live. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Sheila Carapico for a conversation about the crisis in Yemen. Dr. Carapico is a professor of political science and international studies at the University of Richmond and widely recognized as a leading expert on Yemen. A contributing editor to Middle East Report, she was teaching at the American University in Cairo during the Arab Spring and has published essays about the Egyptian and Yemeni revolutions of 2011. Dr. Carapico was a Fulbright scholar who has authored numerous books, articles, and chapters, not only on Yemen, but the Arabian Peninsula and the larger region as well. She is a sought-after voice on current events, and we are especially grateful to her for making time to share her insights into this particularly turbulent time in Yemen's history. We are also deeply grateful to the David Berg Foundation for their support of the museum's 2017-2018 public program season. This is our last public program of 2017, but we will be back with you very soon in 2018, so please look out for an email announcement in January with details about upcoming programs. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carapico in conversation with Executive Vice President and Deputy Director of Museum Programs, Clifford Channon.
Sheila, let me add my greeting and thanks for your coming up here to talk to us about a subject matter that is quite complicated and a bit off the beaten track, even for those of us who tend to follow the Middle East. But to get to Yemen, I wanted you to start a little bit back in time. I think it's almost unfair to think of the country only in terms of what it's going through now. And you've been studying Yemen for a number of years, going back. We met in the early to mid-90s, and that was already a period that you had spent a good deal of time on Yemen. So take us back to the Yemen as you knew it when you were first studying it. What was it like then? What was the environment like, the lives of people? And, you know, projecting forward a little bit, what the transformation has been even before the most recent violence.
That's a great question. Thank you. So I went as a junior year abroad to the American University in Cairo. Before that was fashionable. And while I was in Egypt, I traveled around the region. And Yemen stood out for a number of reasons. One was because it had never been, North Yemen had never been colonized. So it had very minimal Western influence on the one hand. And on the other hand, they also didn't have this inferiority complex that so many post-colonial countries had. And then the other thing about Yemen is that it's just beautiful. So it's high mountains, and deep valleys. There's the Red Sea coast, and then in South Yemen, there's also the Arabian Sea, which is the Indian Ocean coast. There's tremendous ecological variation. And historically, Yemen was known as Arabia Felix. So it was happy Arabia, where there was great population density. I don't know if your colleague wants to pull up the number 4 slide.
The 4th slide that we have some maps we'll show during the course of the
Just to indicate that historically, almost everyone in the Arabian Peninsula lived in Yemen, down in the southwest corner, where again, there are these high mountains, deep valleys, captures monsoon rains from the Indian Ocean. So it's a kind of verdant place, full of very old cities and villages, very kind of quaint and colorful and exotic.
What was the population makeup in terms of the diversity of peoples, both religiously and ethnically?
The people in the highlands, in the northern part of the highlands of North Yemen, of course, these words have become very ubiquitous right now, but they belong to the Zaydi denomination of Shia Islam. The people on the Red Sea coast and in what is still known as the Midlands tended to be of the Shafi'i denomination of Sunni Islam. historically everyone said that those two, the Zaydi Shia and the Sunni, Shafi'i Sunni, were almost indistinguishable, very similar. There's slight differences in how they pray, but for example, you don't have separate mosques. And then ethnically also, there are the people of the highlands who are lighter complected, not as light as you and me, but pretty light. And then the Red Sea coast is almost indistinguishable, both in terms of how people look and also in terms of how they dress and the kinds of homes they live in. If you were dropped down there, you would think you were in maybe Somalia or East Africa. So it has a very kind of African feel. And then at the time, South Yemen was the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, so I only went there once until quite a while later, but it has an Indian Ocean flair and a lot of historical connections to India and indeed Malaysia and Indonesia. So this is a kind of a crossroads of a lot of different cultural influences.
So you mentioned the South Yemen and the North Yemen. There was a period of split and then coming back together. But was that a period that reflected sort of the politics of the leadership or divisions among the population? Or were the people sort of just subject to whatever the political turnings were among the political class?
Well, the origins of that were that South Yemen was colonized by Great Britain. So Aden, the port city, was the only British Crown colony in the Arab world, in the Middle East. And then the other parts, the hinterland, which was known as the protectorates, was South Yemen. And then at a certain point, culminating in 1967, they fought for independence. And like so many other former colonies that got independence quite late, they ended up declaring a People's Democratic Republic. So it was the only Marxist place in the Arab region. And then the North had a very different trajectory. They held on to an imam until 1962. And so there was this division, which was basically a product of British colonialism. The people in the border region felt many of them had relatives, walked back and forth, had common dialects and common diets, and so a lot of them felt as if they were one people. But that was less true the further away you got from the border region.
What was the economy based on?
Agriculture.
The oil wealth had not
No,
come
there was
yet.
basically no oil wealth. So it was the breadbasket of the entire, again, Arabia Felix. And the reason why you see such density over there in the southwest quadrant is because of the possibilities of agriculture. So, it was, basically in those days, pretty much rain-fed or spate, which is surface irrigation of food crops. And then in the meantime, that changed. So that one thing that people may have heard of recently during the war is that almost all food is imported, whereas 40 years ago, they're pretty much self-sufficient in food.
Now, there's been a dramatic growth in population over the period in which you've come to know Yemen well. I'm looking at these numbers: 4.8 million people in 1950, 23.9 million people in 2011, 28 million today, with a projected rise to 46 million by the middle of this century. What impact has that had on the country, this really dramatic, and nowadays in particular, this youth bulge of so much of the population being young? What's been the social impact of that kind of transformation in the population?
This is something that has happened to many countries. And basically, 40, 50 years ago, women were having, 9 pregnancies. And 5 of those children were dying before they reached, say, 10 years old. And then fairly modest improvements in healthcare, including attended births, but in particular vaccines for the very simple, basic diseases like measles and other such things reduced child mortality dramatically in a very short period of time, long before women stopped having 9 kids. Because when they were having 9 kids, it was kind of an insurance policy that some of them would grow up. And so there's this lag, and it is now, I mean, just children everywhere. And of course, social services have not been able to keep up.
Right.
The education system can't keep up. You know, just social services in general are not able to cope. And that, of course, was complicated by the corruption of the government.
That corruption, I mean, we hear about this in many contexts around the world. Was it, you know, particularly devastating to Yemen in your view, or was it, I don't hate to put it quite this way, sort of a garden variety
Yeah, I was
corruption?
just about to say the same thing, kind of garden variety, yeah.
So the country, what sort of an infrastructure was there? Because when we come soon to the present situation, one hears about the infrastructure having been devastated by the war. But how can you describe what, you know, internal transport was like in Yemen, and schools and hospitals and the things that, you know, are the basis of whatever level of society has achieved?
Yeah, I mean, good point. And when I said earlier that, you know, it hadn't been, North Yemen at least had not been colonized and seemed very exotic. And, you know, that's not necessarily an entirely good thing, because there were a few basic highways. The first universities were built in the 70s. Hospitals were still being built in the 70s and the 80s, so very rudimentary infrastructure. And then, you know, pretty good strides in the 90s and the 2000s, but again, hampered by corruption and also by poverty. And then South Yemen was a bit different because, you know, there had been the British colony, particularly around Aden, but then it was very much neglected. So overall, the infrastructure remained, you know, what we used to during the Cold War call Third World or even Fourth World, very rudimentary and not able to keep track again with, as you observe, the growth in population. Nonetheless, I mean, you know, for example, electricity became pretty close to universal access, at least. I mean, in the cities, pretty much everyone had electricity and running water. In smaller towns and villages, you would at least have electricity sometimes, and some vehicular access, and some access to hospitals. Education is a little bit easier than than those other industries because you really only need teachers. Whereas power, water, those are more technologically sophisticated. So when they're bombed, for instance, then that's it.
So I want to come back to this point that you made before about the integration of the different religious populations, because the war as we see it today has essentially broken largely along these lines that were not clearly defined in these earlier times. So you mentioned the Zaidi Shia, the Houthis so-called, a group associated with a leader of that community, and then the Sunnis, who are a rough majority, 55% or something like that. Was there a point along the way that those groups began to separate in your mind, whether some sort of political or sponsorship crisis of outside parties coming into Yemen and trying to stimulate this? We've come to the point where there is now fighting along those lines, but do you see an earlier moment where the integration began to come apart?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a pretty specific moment. I mean, in the first place, no one ever used the word Shia and Sunni at all. Those just were not even in the vocabulary. Until Saudi Arabia started sending in missionaries who we would today call Salafi or perhaps Wahhabi, but they call themselves Sunni. And in particular, they sent, they started founding schools, one in particular in the heart of, just across the border from Saudi Arabia, but in the heart of the territory where these Houthis are. So the Houthis are a family or a group. They're not a sect or a denomination or a school of Islam or anything like that. But, you know, Saudi Arabia was, and they were doing this in Afghanistan and Indonesia and Nigeria and lots of places, funding schools. And there was kind of deliberate provocation of the Zaydis, and then that was the basis of a kind of Zaydi revival in reaction.
So a kind of self-protection.
Self-protection. And so you had a Saudi-funded, what they called Sunni or Salafi school, and then the beginning of the Houthi movement was summer camps that were founded in order to kind of resist what they saw as this outside encroachment. They called themselves the Believing Youth. And then that sort of led to a kind of revival again of sort of Zaydi consciousness. So it's pretty much an imported distinction. Still very few people, except for Salafis, very few people would call themselves Sunni or Shia, although there has been what a number of commentators have called sort of sectarianism, sectarianization. So something that didn't exist before. If you think for a moment about Northern Ireland, you know, Christians or Catholics and Protestants, but that's not something that's everywhere all the time. That's something that existed in a certain historical circumstance and then, you know, also kind of faded away. So that kind of narrative or discourse of sectarian conflict is one that really comes from outside rather than from inside.
Let's talk about the relationship in more traditional times between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. You can see that very long border, if I'm remembering correctly, it's 1,300 miles or something like that. And so a lot of shared characteristics. I'm sure that border is not especially well enforced along its length, so there's movement back and forth, I'm quite sure. How did, in traditional terms, Saudi Arabia see Yemen, and how did Yemen see Saudi Arabia?
So if we could also just pull up slide number 2, which is actually not that good of a visual, the per capita income. And the previous slide also, there were these big blobs of cities along the Gulf Coast, which is
along the Red Sea?
No, not on the Red Sea, on the Gulf.
Okay.
Oh, so on the right-hand side or the eastern side of the slide. You know, historically, until say the middle of the 20th century, Yemen was, you know, again, Arabia Felix, the wealthy part, but then the oil was really discovered in the east on the Gulf Coast. And so you had the rapid growth of Qatar in particular, but also Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia more in some parts than others, that became very kind of filthy rich countries very quickly, dependent very heavily on immigrant labor. And at one point they were predominantly Yemenis. So it was frequently said in the 70s that one son from every Yemeni family went to the Gulf to work and sent home remittances. And then when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Yemen failed to support the monarchies. And 1 million people were thrown out. And so that was really then the beginning of this vast disparity in wealth. And this doesn't show very well, but if you can see the bar chart here, Yemen hardly shows up. It's on the far right.
So it's a tiny little blip, as you can see.
Tiny little blip.
Yeah.
This is before the war. Per capita income in Yemen, $1,500 a year. The other countries, it's 10 to 20 times as much. And that's a huge difference. Yeah. It's a difference in lifestyle. It's a difference in political attitudes. It's just it's like light years away.
Yeah.
So Saudi Arabia, I mean, tends to see Yemen the way that, I don't know, people in Washington, D.C. tend to see West Virginia. You know, it's full of hillbillies and nincompoops and people without teeth. Yemenis, of course, are just like in West Virginia, and they're kind of proud of who they are.
So we were speaking before the program about this sort of this sense of being part of Arabia, and that the national boundaries that have come into such prominence in some cases in the second half of the 20th century, that there was a broader sense of what it was to be from this part of the world, and Yemen had its place in that vision of what it was. What was that sense of Arabia?
Well, I mean, I think one of it, the birthplace of the the Arabic language. So, Al-Lugha al-Arabiyya, al-Jazira al-Arabiyya, the language of the Arabian Peninsula, they consider that to be the language.
The original Arabic.
And then that goes along with the birthplace of Islam. And a kind of sense, and this is true of so many people in so many parts of the world, their sense is that this is the center of the world. It's, the Queen of Sheba was from Yemen. All these antiquities, like living cities and towns that are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. A kind of sense, we're the center of the world. And again, without, I think, in Egypt or much of North Africa, where they also, of course, in Egypt have that huge sense of history, but they also have the sense of having been repeatedly conquered by Europeans, which the Arabian Peninsula did not have, with the exception of the port of Aden. So, quite a lot of sense that we speak the language, and we have the religion, and we were strong and
proud of our
heritage,
and our history. Yeah. So let's move forward now, because I do want to come to the current situation, which has pretty much uprooted almost everything you've described. And it begins in Yemen, events that would ultimately burst out into war, but those events begin as part of the Arab Spring.
Right.
And so Yemen has a long-time dictator who has recently been killed, but we'll come to that later, Ali Salih, who has somehow managed, through shifting alliances and so on and so forth, to hold power and exercise it strongly, corruptly, brutally at times. And the first movements against him are inspired by what's happening elsewhere in the Arab world. Can you pick up the impact of those broader events and what they brought to Yemen at that point in 2011?
It's interesting that the so-called Arab Spring, the uprisings, were predominantly in 5 countries. Bahrain is a little bit of an exception. They were all republics that had previously overthrown dynasties, kings, and where incumbent presidents were preparing their sons to take power, or in the case of Syria, where the son had already taken over from his father.
So let's just enumerate. I mean, Egypt being one.
Tunisia,
Libya.
Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. So all of them with grievances about that, about corruption, about guys who had stayed in power for approximately 30 years, so the majority of this youthful population had never seen anything else. And so there was the uprising in Yemen, which was in some respects much more predictable. I was living in Egypt at the time. But in some respects, the uprising in Yemen was more predictable, because Yemen is a bit freer place anyway, so you could feel it coming. You could feel it coming in Egypt too. People take to the streets in huge numbers, and whereas in Tunisia, and then I'll speak to Egypt because I was there, 18 days and Hosni Mubarak resigned. Yemen, it went on and on and on, and people just stayed in the streets, and armed tribesmen threw down their weapons to protest peacefully. And women were front and center. People may recall that there was a Yemeni woman, Tawakkol Karman, who was the person who got the acknowledgement of the Nobel Peace Prize as the leader of the Arab uprisings. And then, I mean, this isn't quite the question you asked, but it is my take. So the kingdoms of the Arabian Peninsula, I mean, they were worried about the uprising in Tunisia. They were worried about Egypt. They were worried about Libya. They were worried about Syria. They were panicked about Yemen.
Because it's so
it's
close.
Right there. It's so close. Yeah. And it's half the indigenous population of the whole region. And so they really intervened in order to try to manage the transition.
I should say, for all the other countries in that Gulf region, they are all monarchies.
They're all monarchies.
Kingdoms,
Yemen
royal
is
families.
the only republic. It's the only place that ever has elections. I mean, they're not the most perfect elections in the world,
Right.
but there's a bigger divide between elections and non-elections than there is between perfect elections and imperfect elections.
Right.
And
so this was a contagion that they were worried
it was
would
a
spread.
contagion that they were very worried about. I don't want to get too down in the weeds, but basically they tried to create a transition which only amounted to Ali Salih resigning.
The long-time corrupt president.
The long-time corrupt president, and handing over power to his own hand-picked vice president. This is like a makeover. It's not like some sort of, regime change.
Right.
And the vice president, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, currently referred to as the internationally recognized president of Yemen because he has no recognition domestically, and he lives in Saudi Arabia. So he's internationally, but not domestically recognized. It's a start. And, there was, kind of this contrived one-man election for 2 years, which expired 2 years ago. But the idea was that the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is the alliance of these monarchies of the peninsula, would manage Yemen's transition.
And there was a sort of a stagnant period of a couple of years there where they're trying to put the pieces in place and bring the various factions and groups together to negotiate some kind of a compact or agreement, but that fails.
Yes, essentially. I mean, there was a national dialogue committee. I must say, initially I was pretty optimistic, but it just dragged on and on and on. And the other flaw in that was that they had given, and this was primarily the Gulf monarchies, had given Salih, although he was persuaded to hand over power, he had immunity from prosecution, and he remained as head of the party with the majority in parliament. So he retained a huge amount of popular influence, within the country. And his kids, his son in particular, maintained his command of the Republican Guard, which was the most sophisticated of the military force.
When does the fighting begin?
So meanwhile, so these Houthi guys who had responded in a couple of questions ago to the Saudi Wahhabi Salafi incursion with the Zaidi revival, they had fought 6 separate wars against Ali Salih while Salih was president. This is where it gets really confusing and hard to follow. Okay.
But let me just make one point, and correct me if I'm wrong. But 6 wars, yes, but wars that come to either a brokered agreement or it sort of stops for a while at different points along the way.
Right, except that what's noteworthy, of course, is that you have the central government, with the help of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, unable to break the backs of these ragtag guys in flip-flops from, the far northern mountains. Mm-hmm. So, it's in such an asymmetric situation, right. The failure to defeat those guys is a kind of defeat for the central government. So this was a problem, and there are a lot of personality things here that I just can't go into because I would lose everybody. But, so the Houthis are gaining steam. Salih has resigned. The public protests have stopped. There's a stalemate in terms of politics. And then 2 things happened, both frankly urged by foreign donors. One was some sort of federal scheme where they just drew a map kind of arbitrarily, the way you've heard of so much colonial history. And
you would think that this
You would
idea
think
of
that
drawing maps would sort of
you
have
think
stopped
they,
by
and
now,
yet
yeah.
it became fashionable. Like there were all these experts coming in saying, here's how you could draw this map. And, trying to decide, how do you translate federalism into Arabic? Is it federali? In other words, the English word? Or do you take an Arabic word and make it sound like maybe it means that, except it doesn't really? Anyway, there's that. And then they also, at the advice of the International Monetary Fund, how good of an idea was this one, decided to raise fuel prices precipitously for the sake of budget balancing. Houthis, they march out of their mountain home place and they come to Sana'a, and nobody stops them. And then Salih, their sworn enemy for all these years, throws his forces, the forces still under his command, still on his payroll, on their behalf.
So he turns against his
He
own
turns
former
it-
vice president.
Yep,
Now,
and joins them.
Yeah.
When it happened, I started hearing rumors of this, and I was like, no, that can't be. Because it just didn't make sense. But sure enough, that's what he did. And then their combined forces had some success. So Hadi, the replacement vice president who'd become president, he runs away, first to Aden in the south, and then to Riyadh, which is the capital of Saudi Arabia. And when he gets to Riyadh, he says, help, I want you to restore me to power. And the new king and his son, installed with no experience whatsoever as the defense minister, are like, sure, we could bomb Yemen into submission in no time. That was March 2015.
2015, so we're 2.5 years into this. Now, it is kind of a perfect storm in the sense that the new Saudi government, or the king and the deputy crown prince, I believe at that point, but the young man who is trying to establish his authority and credentials, it seemed they were almost looking for an occasion to show just how effective and strong they could be. And Yemen seems to have presented itself, at least in their imagining, as the opportunity to do this. But it didn't quite turn out that way. So at what point, the Saudis don't really send a lot of ground troops in. They're bombing from the air. There are some ground troops from the Emirates. Yeah.
Mostly Sudanese or other conscripts from other countries.
So
we're told not to call them mercenary.
And but they go in thinking this is going to be a cakewalk. Yeah. And what was their strategy? What were they there to do, the Saudis?
They were there, in my view, to assert Saudi hegemony over outcomes in Yemen. Mm-hmm. If we say this guy Hadi is going to be president, then he's going to be president, even though he lives in Saudi Arabia and has no following or anything like that. But and there's been a history of this. Again, not to get too weedy, there have been previous histories of Saudi interventions in Yemen, and so it's not just that this happened in 2015. There's been quite a history of it.
Now, the Saudis, not sending a land army in there, decide that they can win this war from the air, which 2.5 years later has not proven to be the case, though they have wreaked extraordinary damage on the infrastructure, just the country that, as we were speaking about it earlier. Has that been the consistent Saudi strategy here, simply to bomb their way to victory if they could get there?
Some of us have been debating whether this approach warrants the use of the word strategy, because you got to wonder, how they thought that was going to work. But, what they have done, they've crippled the ports. They started out by, one of the first raids was Sana'a Airport, and then Hodeidah Port, which would be over here on the Red Sea, on that side. And since then, I mean, it's been power plants and also hospitals. Médecins Sans Frontières and others have documented that. There was another bombing of a hospital in a godforsaken, 2 air raids on a hospital in a godforsaken, poverty-stricken town with no Houthi sympathizers in them whatsoever today. And you know, some of that, I think they did kind of quick studies of the rules of war, and if you call it essential infrastructure. So during World War II, the United States would bomb German factories on the grounds that they were being used to build munitions, and that was considered to be legal under international law. Saudi Arabia has interpreted that to mean that it's also legal to bomb, say, potato chip factories, you know, things that have no military use. But, you know, the United States and other NATO powers, particularly the weapons exporters, have basically supported the Saudi war effort.
Right. The Houthis have turned and gotten support. I'm not sure it's at the same level, though. This is where Iran comes into the picture as well. So if the Houthi forces have a sponsor on their side, or multiple sponsors, linking them to the Saudis, the Houthis need an outside supporter too, presumably, and this is where Iran figures into the picture.
You know, the Houthis have this very strange they use an Iranian slogan, which is death to America and death to Israel. You gotta wonder, what the heck are they talking about? Because Israel, I mean, really doesn't matter to Yemen. It's way far away. And the Iranians, particularly Press TV, which is the Iranian propaganda outlet, I mean, they cheer the Houthis. You know, they really, so there's moral support there. There has still yet to be any hard evidence of Iranian support. There was, during the brief period when the Houthis took over Sana'a, Iran started having frequent flights, I believe daily flights into Sana'a. But that only lasted for like a month before Saudi Arabia destroyed the airport.
There was the incident of the shooting of the missile by the Houthis, which is said to be an Iranian missile.
Which, you know what? There's no photograph. It is said more precisely to have Iranian parts,
right,
but more American parts. But there has yet to be a photograph of Iranian weapons, because the Salih administration was awash in weapons. They had ample weapons. I mean, they don't have an air force or anything like that. So the air and naval power are completely on the Saudi-led coalition. But the evidence for, I mean, it's talked about a lot. But, and I'm actually not relying on my own judgment on this, but rather on a group of people with serious military expertise who just keep looking everywhere constantly for a photograph of an Iranian weapon.
In the broader logic of what's going on in that part of the world, though, the extension of the Saudi-Iranian conflict along sectarian lines, I mean, it makes sense that it would reach into this place as well. I mean, it's happening in all kinds of ways. And I'm not claiming that's proof of the origins of the missile, but it does seem that this conflict is being regionalized here too, as it was in Iraq, as it was in Syria, and so on.
So could we see slide number 5? So this is Saudi Arabia claiming that what they're doing is attacking Iran. This is a Yemeni cartoonist. He's very generous in allowing me to use his cartoons. Without the Iran excuse, what would Saudi Arabia claim is a good reason to be bombing poverty-stricken country who hasn't done anything to them?
Right.
And the answer is, oh, we're fighting against Iranian influence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But in the absence, I mean, now in Syria, I grant you,
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense that Iran and Saudi Arabia are backing opposite sides.
Yeah.
But I think as an excuse for destruction on this scale, in the absence of either a provocation from the Yemenis, okay, or serious evidence of Iranian involvement,
Mm-hmm.
then it becomes, to my mind, not a persuasive
Mm-hmm.
argument.
Let's talk about the humanitarian catastrophe that is a result, because I have some numbers here. And if we can go back to the map, because I think it's interesting to sort of see this in the context of the map. But let's see. The UN says 2/3 of Yemen's 28 million population face shortages of food and clean water. A staggering 7 million are now on the brink of famine. A cholera epidemic is raging. The war has killed an estimated 10,000 people, but far more are at risk or have died from the conditions they're living in, not from the violence of war. So this reaches, there are parts of the country that are apparently less affected, but this reaches pretty much across Yemen, regardless of which side is being affected, because the blockade keeps food from everybody. So what do you know of the impact of this on Yemen itself?
Well, I mean, as you suggest, it is, actually, if you could go back to the slide number 4, just because it shows the population density a little bit. Mm-hmm. So the worst impact, not surprisingly, is where most of the people live, and that's on the Red Sea side. And then where along the coast of the Gulf of Aden, the way it's marked there, that's considered to be under coalition backed forces. Mm-hmm. And in particular, it's patrolled by at least some foot soldiers from the United Arab Emirates, or again, hired by the United Arab Emirates. In response to that missile that was lobbed into Saudi Arabia fairly recently, they closed even the ports on the Gulf of Aden side, the Arabian Sea side, that are said to be under control of their allies, which makes no sense, except as a deliberate policy of starvation. And that's been the conclusion that's increasingly coming from organizations like Oxfam, Human Rights Watch, right. The UNHCR and the National right. Commission on Refugees. I mean, the humanitarian organizations are telling that story.
This is the largest humanitarian catastrophe underway in the world right now. Now, what has this done for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is also a factor on the ground there, not as large as some of those other forces, but well established in parts of the less densely populated areas of Yemen? What has this conflict meant for them?
Well, you know, the irony is, of course, that the Houthis do fight against al-Qaeda. So the United States is supporting the side of the conflict that is at war with al-Qaeda, and at the same time is at war with al-Qaeda. But al-Qaeda gained considerable territory. They've been beaten back a bit now, but on the Gulf of Aden down the southern coast, which is the Arabian Sea, and then it feeds out. You can't quite see it on this map, but it feeds
towards the
out.
Omani border there.
Towards the Omani border, and then out to the Indian Ocean. But several of those areas, there are a few. That one spot there, it's a port called Al-Muqalla. For 2 years, it was under al-Qaeda control, as Salih and other, originally government forces kind of withdrew. And so al-Qaeda overran certain portions of what are considered to be sympathetic to the coalition. And now one of the things that I can't even make a coherent statement about, which was the reason for that pause, because there are certainly rumors that the United Arab Emirates is in cahoots with Al-Qaeda. But I don't want to say that because I don't actually, all I know is that there are rumors. And I'm not actually trying to spread those rumors, but I am acknowledging that those rumors exist because the Emirates are presumably the dominant force in these areas, and yet it's clear that Al-Qaeda are running amok.
Now, is this area where Al-Qaeda has some nominal control, I mean, is this an area that could become another one of those ungoverned spaces where other forces or others come, you know, to join Al-Qaeda in its effort? I mean, we saw the evaporation, essentially, of the Islamic State in Iraq and most of it in Syria, so that now is not an option. And obviously, there's a distinction between ISIS and AQAP, but the idea that there's room to maneuver is something that, conceivably anyway, is quite attractive to people looking for that room.
You know, and ISIS, which of course the English language acronym means the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't necessarily think they'd show up in Yemen because it's not Iraq or Syria, but they've been cited. And the area there, and again, that's why this population map is useful, because some of this is wide open near desert. And that's ideal for, you know, armed groups that want to stay clandestine.
So the most recent turn involves the death through sectarian fighting with his once allies, then former allies of Ali Salih, the former president, who was back, but who had decided he was going to offer himself back to the Saudis, turn on the Houthis. In intramural conflict, he is killed. And there was some thought that, you know, as familiar a rogue as he was, he might be the guy who could somehow calm things down there. With his death, what do you see as the prospect going forward for some kind of solution to this?
I don't know. I mean, the past week I was saying to you before we started, if I had written a speech, I would have had to throw it away and start from scratch in the past, you know, whatever it's been, 10 days or something like that. So he made a speech in which he said that he had decided that the Houthis, who he had been fighting alongside of for 2.5 years, were indeed Iranian-backed. And that he was going to turn a new page with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And then something happened, and I must say it's still not 100% clear, but it does seem that he was assassinated by his erstwhile allies, the Houthis, you know, who don't have that much popular support. He actually has been gaining popular support. And this didn't completely come out of the blue. So, for example, in the capital, Sana'a, since about August or September, Salih's group and the Houthis have been staging rival rallies. So getting, you know, in some cases, tens or even maybe hundreds of thousands of men into the streets. Very different, I might add, from 2011, when there's these mass popular demonstrations, but they're full of children and women. These were full of armed men. Very different kind of thing. So they were kind of facing off with one another. But now you have the Houthis minus Salih, who was the one with the weapons. And they may have seized some of them, but they're not going to. So they're presumably weakened, but also emboldened, I think. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia seems to be bombing even more intently.
Yeah.
And I don't really see a way out. I mean, Oman, you know, has made some efforts to mediate. The Netherlands. But the UN Security Council is derelict in their responsibility. The United States continues to support the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I think that the Saudi, particularly the Crown Prince, they want an unconditional victory.
But shouldn't it have occurred to them by now that they've failed over 2.5 years to do that, and their strategy is not changing? Are they looking for a way out, by contrast? The reporting was that Salih, in making this turn, was somehow offering the Saudis the possibility of a way out, declare victory, and leave. And that door now gets shut. I mean, are they committed to going deeper into the swamp, or is there some sense that they'd like to find some way out of this?
You know, I wish that I thought that. I'm not sure I do, but I wish I did.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, last question, then we'll see what our audience has to say. But, you know, the situation we've described, the devastation of Yemen, is paralleled in Iraq and in Syria and in other parts of the Middle East, which have suffered through these internecine conflicts, which also bring outsiders and their weapons to bear. Maybe you want to just answer for Yemen, or maybe you have a sense of the broader problem. But, you know, at some point it stops, and then what is left? And what are the efforts that would be needed to reconstitute anything resembling a functioning society after all this is done?
I mean, I think that Iraq is a better parallel than Syria, because Syria really is internecine conflict, whereas Iraq began with foreign intervention. Right. And what we've seen is that long since the intervention has ended, there has been, again, the sectarianization of, you know, domestic factions fighting against one another over the spoils of a ruined state.
Yeah.
And I wish I thought, and we haven't even actually talked about, and I'm not sure I want to get into it, but, you know, what used to be South Yemen, I mean, they want out. They want independence. And so there's also that conflict. But unfortunately, I think that Iraq is kind of the, I don't want to use the word model because that's the last thing you would say. Yeah. But, you know, a kind of harbinger.
Yeah, of where
it's very difficult to see a way out of this at this point. Yeah. You know, put the women in charge, see how that goes.
Fair point. Fair point.
I wanted to cheer people up a little bit. I thought that would work.
Let's see if we have any questions from the floor. I can do more. William, just wait for a mic. And please stand up.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was extremely informative and rather distressing. Are there any, not your presentation, but the facts, are there any stabilizing forces that could come into play to do some good?
You know, there are some indigenous conflict resolution mechanisms. So surprisingly, given the bad image that a lot of outsiders have, tribes have quite strong mechanisms for negotiating, separating warring sides. They have, for example, historic concepts of something that's called hijra, and it means a place where fighters will not go or will not bring their weapons, and where it's like sanctuary. It's exactly sanctuary. And there have been, on a larger scale, historic efforts to engage in something like a national dialogue of political forces where you get different people together and, you know, try to hammer things out. But unfortunately, those things don't work if the dominant force in the conflict is outside. I mean, and so one question to go back is, what, and you were suggesting that the Saudis want a way out, but it's difficult to see what their incentive would be to negotiate or to compromise or to bargain, because they have the upper hand.
Do they?
They've got the air power and the naval power.
But it's a strange dynamic because they have this vast array of weaponry that they've bought, and they haven't been able to win. Now, there's a strategic problem there, which is you need boots on the ground to do, but that creates its own dead end. So the Saudis, in trying to flex their muscles, are reinforcing weakness as much as they are power.
Vietnam.
They're all very encouraging parallels. You wanted one? Yeah. Wait for Harmony, please. I mean Harmony the person rather than Harmony, the unified concept of everyone getting along in the world.
Thanks. And it has been very interesting. I attend these talks regularly, and I can't count the number of speakers who have claimed that the Iranians are influencing what's going on in Yemen. You're the first to step up and say maybe that's not true. Maybe you comment on how all the others are coming to that conclusion that may not be founded?
That's a great question, actually. Because it is widely reported that way. That's certainly the Saudi line, because again, otherwise their excuse for this intervention is pretty thin. And, and I don't even blame this entirely on Trump, because I think it was true of Obama as well. Accepting the Saudi narrative also provides a rationale for continuing to sell weapons. And there's a kind of willingness to believe, which goes back to 1979, sort of stories that demonize Iran. And so it's become the prevalent narrative. I was just reading something today, which is not quite ready for publication, but sort of trying to trace where that storyline came from. Originally from Salih, when he was president, and trying to say, well, these Houthis are backed by Iran, therefore I need weapons. And then also the American press, and also the American press picking that up, although the American researchers, the American and European researchers who started noticing the Houthis, around 2000 and, I want to say 3, 4, and then for the next, decade and a half, nobody who did field research discovered any evidence of Iranian anything. So never encountered any Iranians in the area, never encountered any Persian language books. And again, these other guys that I'm in touch with who investigate the weaponries, and some of these are people who, they can look at a film of the missile and tell you what kind it is. So, I mean, that's way beyond my military expertise. But, sometimes these storylines take on a life of their own and are part of the arsenal of what is used. And so I know one of your speakers, who is a colleague of mine, but spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia hearing their version of it. And so it's not surprising that he would see it in that way. So I wouldn't say, well, you should believe me and not these other speakers, because that's disingenuous or something. But maybe to be alert to the possibility that it's not so self-evident.
One more, if you would come here. Yeah, please. Would you stand up, please?
Oh,
sorry. No.
what is the purpose of Saudi Arabia going into Yemen? What is their goal and their ultimate goal? And why are they continuing to just bomb? I mean, what are they looking for? What is...
I mean, let me draw attention just briefly to also the Saudi rift with Qatar. which is completely different than the bombing of Yemen. But Qatar, they're trying very hard to punish Qatar, which is the only part of the peninsula that's even richer than Saudi Arabia and a couple of the others. And basically they're angry with Qatar for not allowing Saudi Arabia to be the government that speaks for the whole peninsula. They have a very strong sense that we're the ones who ought to be in charge. And I think that applies more to Yemen because it's so poverty-stricken than to Qatar. But you see it also in its relationships with Qatar as well, and with Bahrain. And so, I mean, I think that, and in particular under this crown prince, you know, with the hubris and so forth, there's a strong desire to say, you know, we are Arabia. And if the Yemenis don't acquiesce to Saudi preferences for their leadership or threaten, you know, popular demonstrations, then we're going to put them in their place. Make sure that they don't have the capacity to disrupt the kingdom. That's my view.
I saw one more in the back. I'll just wait for the mic, please. And since you're a Mets fan, I'm glad I chose you.
Hi, and thank you for your time. I'm just curious, what's the Dutch perspective? Why are they looking to get involved in any form? What do they have to gain?
You know, thank you for that one. So there was a United Nations resolution quite early on, 2216, which called on which imposed sanctions on the Houthis and Salih, and called for the sanctions meant that they ought not to be able to receive weapons. And unfortunately, it being a UN Security Council resolution, it would have been in the view of people who are fans of international law, they would have called on all parties to stop fighting, some kind of general ceasefire, but it didn't do that. All it did was it called on the Houthis and Salih to put down their weapons and did not mention that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and the other members of the coalition are also belligerents. The Netherlands, can't actually remember the exact date, but they attempted to bring a resolution before the Security Council calling for an overall ceasefire. And the United States, France, and Great Britain didn't want that. I think, you know, the Netherlands were doing what small powers sometimes can and often should do, which is to try to take a position grounded in international law and a quest for peace. But in this case, they didn't get very far.
Well, this is one that,
Sorry.
no, you know, we look at these issues in the Middle East and elsewhere, and they are difficult and they are complicated. The small virtue they have is that they give us ongoing programming. So that's my segue into thanking everybody for coming this season's programs. And of course, we'll resume most likely in February. As Jess said, you'll get an email, and please sign up for our notices as the programs resume. And we will be continuing these fascinating discussions. But until then, I'd like you to join me in thanking Sheila Carapico for coming here and telling us about Yemen.